share again this slide. And okay. So this is an introduction to the OCJP Strategic Planning and Priority Setting session. The Office of Criminal Justice Program does a 5-year strategic plan that really encompasses all of our state and federal funding and all the activities that we do that inform our strategic plan. Today, we're going to talk about an overview of how we develop that 5-year strategic plan, but we also do an annual addendum because a 5-year strategic plan is pretty encompassing and things change from year to year. You can have emerging issues, you can get new funding, there can be new priority areas. And so OCJP does an annual addendum to the 5-year plan. And today we're going to do an overview to all of that strategic plan. In years past, and I bring this up only because you may hear it referred to in this direction. This right here, if you ever hear anybody lovingly refer to the OCJP football, it's really this design. It was spread out on a wall and it kind of arced up towards the top and came back in a circle around towards the bottom. It looked like a football shape, and so we called it the football. Mostly we just talk about it from our strategic planning process. But basically what we're doing is every year we are identifying the community problems and needs across all of the criminal justice system. So that's everything from law enforcement and courts, reentry programming, juvenile programming, down to victim services, and really overall looking at what are the needs that we're hearing about within the state, what are the emerging issues. The next thing that we do is really look at inventorying our resources and identifying our gaps. In terms of inventorying our resources, what we're really looking at is how much funding do we have in any particular fund source? You know, have we just recently gotten a new award? Do we have some leftover funding from the last year that wasn't expended? What are the priority areas for each of the funding sources? And where do we either have a gap in needing to expend some funding towards a specific priority, or where have we identified an emerging issue or need where we've got a fund source with available dollars that could be applied to that emerging issue or need. Then throughout the year, as we're attending various task forces, advisory committees, going to conferences, pulling together stakeholder groups, doing surveys with subrecipients, and holding our own strategic planning meetings. Our next step is to really establish priority issues. So there's a lot of issues in the criminal justice system, and our funding will never be able to meet all of the needs. Quite literally, when we started as an organization, all of our funding was thought to be for the criminal justice system, and especially for like law enforcement, prosecution, those sides of the criminal justice system. We really only have pilot project type funding. So we'll never be able to meet all of the needs within the criminal justice system, but there are some needs that rise to the top because they are a new issue that's happening, and we need to see if we can find a solution to that issue. It might we might establish a priority based on how can we have the biggest bang for our buck? Like, how can we spend dollars that will make the most impact on the criminal justice system or will help in a specific way with a particular piece of the criminal justice system? That might be linking information systems to ensure that data gets in the right hands of those that need it. Or it could be a specific pilot project towards working on violent crime with a particular population. So once we have this list of emerging needs and problems, and we know what funding we have available and we know where the gaps are, then we start to prioritize those needs. Where can we put our dollars, again, where they'll have the biggest pang and have the biggest impact? And then we look to design the program response. So that comes about in a number of different ways. I think you may have heard already, and if not, you will hear, we are very focused on evidence-based programming and evidence-based budgeting. Basically, we want to put our dollars towards programs that we know are effective and that work and can have a measurable impact on what the problem is. And so we learn about those evidence-based programs in a number of ways, or even some of the innovative and promising programs in a number of ways. Sometimes we hear about it in the various advisory committees and task force meetings we go to. Maybe we hear about it at a state or national conference. Maybe we hear about it from another state agency or program partner who's doing similar work. Maybe we've done some research and learned about it or attended a virtual training, but we try to learn as much as we can about what are the evidence-based programming that impact the kind of problems that we're experiencing here in Tennessee. And then we go to our group of criminal justice professionals and we say, here's what we're hearing might work. What do you think will work given the problem and what the need is and what we could potentially spend? Do you think, which of these programs, evidence-based programs, do you think will work? The feedback we also want to really hear from them that is so critically important is not just what has worked in other communities, but what has the potential of working in Tennessee? Because we always hear about how, well, that might work in Memphis, but it won't work in Nashville. Or, well, that might work in the city, but it won't work in rural Tennessee. In East Tennessee, I remember saying, well, you can do that on that side of the mountain, but you can't do that over here. That won't work over here. We've heard comments like that in various different strategic planning and advisory committee meetings. And so it's really important to design the programs based on what are the stakeholders, what are the people who are going to potentially be implementing these projects and programs, what do they think will work? From there, we're really developing our solicitations to put our funding plans out. So we develop a solicitation, post it to the website, have applications submitted. When the applications are submitted, they're reviewed. We come up with by a review team. The review team comes up with a potential funding plan, which goes to leadership for approval, and then we go to contract. And what you'll notice, especially as you start to read our contracts and read our program descriptions, is our method of strategic planning is based on a logic model, and our grant management is based on a logic model. We really ask our subrecipients to identify their community problems and needs, identify and inventory what resources they've already bringing to bear on the project and where the gaps are. to establish their priorities for the funding, to design their programs and implement it. So we get all those contracts in place with this logic model design of what their project is going to entail. The next step in our strategic planning and priority setting is to manage our projects and monitor our activities. You know, is it working the way we thought it was going to work? Is it working with the population we thought it was going to work with? Are they getting enough referrals in? Do the activities need to be adjusted? Is there less of an interest in providing or excuse me, participating in activities during the business day and more desire for the activities in the evening hours? Do we need to switch things up? And through managing the projects and monitoring the activities, you know, we are evaluating how successful those projects were, or very often finding out that they weren't as successful as we thought they would be. When we find out they're not successful, we then look at, well, what can we do to improve the outcomes? Like, did we get feedback that this isn't the right population, or services need to be provided in a different way? And so sometimes we make adjustments like that and put out another solicitation, or sometimes we just make the adjustments with the individual projects, hoping to help them be more successful. But all in all, then we evaluate how well did that meet the need that we heard from across the criminal justice system? How well did that solution address the issues that were arising? And should it be replicated? Should we do more of it? Or did we figure out that it didn't really work and it's time to try something new, and the process starts all over again? So this diagram here is really twofold. It's how we approach our overall strategic planning for OCJP as a large office, but then it's also the basis of our logic model and what we require from grantees to develop for us when they are requesting funding from our office. And then part of the reason that we put it in that format is when it's in a logic model, when there's a problem description, goals, objectives, activities, a timeline, outputs, outcomes, data assessments, you know, how are you going to collect the data? How are you going to review the data? It becomes a tool for the subrecipient to evaluate their own success. Well, how well did I do what I said I was going to do? Did I do all the activities the way I said I was going to do the activities? Did I achieve the results I said I was going to achieve? If it's not working that way, what adjustments need to be made? And so not only do we provide a tool that helps us evaluate whether the projects are successful, but really the agencies can use that same grant application to evaluate their own success in their project implementation. And so this is the big picture of our overall strategic planning and priority setting. And because of that, I always like to talk about in this very first session how important you all are, especially as new grant managers. You're going to pick up contracts that are in various stages. Some might be at the very last year, some might have just started, but you really have an opportunity to learn what those programs are doing, assess and evaluate how well they're doing it, and bring that information back to leadership, back to your supervisors, back to the assistant directors, certainly to the OCJP conversations and the boots on the ground conversations, and really kind of highlight what's working well and what's not working well. And that feeds all of our strategic plan. So every person in this office is a key member and a key participant in the OCJP strategic planning process because of the work that you do for the office, because of the way you interact with the subrecipients, and the way you can share information with us on what's working and not working and how we maybe can make adjustments. So I really like to use this time to stress how you all have a voice and how important it is to the overall OCJP strategic planning. So now I'm going to walk through each one of these stages in a little more detail to some extent and kind of provide some additional information about what informs our strategic plan. So when it comes to identifying problems and needs and gaps, I talked about several of these things. We attend conferences and training, so we learn on the state level and on the national level, what are the emerging issues that are happening and who's implementing something that is successful. I talked about task forces that we attend, like the dangerous drug task forces, advisory committees. We have the Family Justice Center Advisory Committee. We have the Sexual Assault Providers Working Group. We have the Domestic Violence Shelter Executive Directors Meeting. And then OCJP does an annual roundtable meeting each year. We convene a group of criminal justice stakeholders from across the criminal justice system, and we lay out for them, hey, these are the emerging issues we're seeing, and these are some of the ideas of programming we have. We get their input back on what they're seeing as emerging issues and whether they align with what we're seeing or if they're identifying something different. They let us know where the biggest gaps are, where people are really struggling to have funding or to implement a program. And then they help us evaluate the various evidence-based programming on how well this would align with this emerging issue, whether a specific evidence-based program would work in Tennessee, or maybe sometimes it's what it would take to work. Because a lot of times you have to do a little education and sharing of information at the state partners level to garner that buy-in to try to implement a specific program. So, and then each administration tends to have some form of its own strategic plan overall for the state. And depending on the priorities of the particular leadership and different governors have different priorities. But the administration also helps us to identify and prioritize what some of the emerging issues are. When Governor Bill Lee came into office, he established a criminal justice investment task force. That task force met regularly and came up with goals and objectives, and that informed our needs and resource gaps. We were very lucky because the governor's criminal justice investment task force had some recommendations that just naturally aligned with the work that we were already doing. So we were very, very lucky because it was just a smooth fit and a smooth transition for us. It has been a number of years, as you can see, given that Governor Lee is now in his second tenure as governor, and back in January of 2019, it was when he had used Executive Order 6 to establish the Criminal Justice Investment Task Force. And they released their first recommendations in December of 2019. So they took a full year. They went across the state and held listening groups. And some of the initial data that they got out of those listening sessions with various criminal justice and victim service providers across the state. Some of the most relevant data to our office and that kind of informed the various policy recommendations that were relevant to us was the data you see here. You know, he wanted, and this group wanted to address the dramatic increase in the length of time spent incarcerated. Certainly, Governor Lee has been an advocate of justice-involved individuals and their successful reintegration into our communities. They wanted to look at the over-reliance on incarceration, especially for nonviolent individuals and people who are just violating their probation and parole. They wanted to address the stark increase in the number of women in prison. Certainly, that has been something that has been growing. The steady growth in mental health caseloads at our corrections facilities. I mean, for a number of years, we've been talking about how as mental health services have dwindled in the community, and as there's fewer and fewer facilities for those with mental health issues and needs, that our criminal justice system has become the de facto treatment provider. That's a role they don't want to undertake, and one that is not really in their forte, but it's been something that we've had to deal with. And then, of course, the deficit in treatment and reentry supports that are necessary for individuals to succeed when returning to their community from any kind of custodial sentence. That can be, 1129 at a local jail, and it can be a 10-year stint at a state prison. Okay, how you guys doing? Any questions? All right, you're very quiet. I'm going to move on. So out of that task force came 23 policy recommendations. And because not all of those policy recommendations directly related to the work that we do, I haven't included all of them, but just a smattering for you to see how this connects to the work that we do. So one of the policy recommendations was strengthening responses to individuals with behavioral health needs. We've done that in a number of ways using a number of state and federal funding. And in fact, we received $10 million in evidence-based programming for local jails with the focus specifically on addressing behavioral health needs of those justice-involved individuals who are incarcerated in local jail facilities just this year. So that solicitation is posted. It'll close at the end of this week, and hopefully we'll have some additional programming. Ensuring equal opportunities to state individuals housed in local jails. I mean, that is a direct connection to the increased state funding that we received for evidence-based programming. However, OCJP has been providing funding for reentry and jail-based programming for at least 10 years, if not longer, probably closer to 20 years, utilizing our JAG funding. Prior to recovery courts going over to the Department of Mental Health and Substance Abuse Services, recovery courts were started within OCJP. Some of those recovery courts support programs start within the local jails, meaning that everybody who enters the program does a period in the local jail where they're getting treatment while they're incarcerated, and then they get released and moved into community-based treatment. Focusing state resources on violent and high-risk individuals, improving the efficiency and effectiveness of community supervision, minimizing barriers to successful reentry, and ensuring the sustainability of criminal justice reforms. And of course, the state has put state funding towards these things. You know, we have received the violent crime intervention funding that has gone to law enforcement to help them better address violent crime in local communities and implement evidence-based programming related to violent crime. We have received additional state funding for criminal background collection. Well, let me say it this way. We provide funding for the APHIS machines, which collect the fingerprints and connect the fingerprints to the state ID card, and for every individual who is charged with a crime where there is a formal beyond a citation where they actually take the fingerprints, and all of that enhances our criminal background checking capacity within the state, which helps ensure that only those that are allowed to carry a handgun are able to carry a handgun, and helps with other forms of criminal background checking for employment and such needs. But we have received additional state funding to assist local communities with having those devices. In terms of minimizing barriers to successful reentry, I think this is on Susan's team, and I believe it's an initiative that Nicole is overseeing, but we have the Public Defender Social Work Program. We utilize our JAG funding for that, and we provide funding to provide a social worker within the Public Defender's Office to help get those individuals connected to services while they're in the process of addressing their criminal case. It's really been an innovative project. It's an innovative project that has received state and national attention. It's been demonstrated to be effective because without the connection to resources, the individuals fail to reach a state of stability where they can decrease their interactions with the criminal justice system and have certainly a much more successful reintegration into the community. How about this slide or anything related to Governor Lee's task force and how their listening sessions and the data points led to the policy recommendations, and how those policy recommendations kind of tie into our own OCJP strategic plan and some of the funding that we've received from the governor's office? Any questions?
I guess I have one.
Sure.
What does it often look like? A lot of the program, is there a lot of overlap amongst the programs in regards to some of these like policies? So I know like specifically I'm working on the one grant funding with Tennessee Strong Families, but is there often a lot of like just program overlap and kind of working together and meeting some of these, I guess, the measures of the strategic planning?
Yeah, Katie. So there is overlap at times. And I guess let me think about the best way to answer that, I think, is to give a couple of examples. So sometimes we have funding that can go towards similar means. Like we have a number of fund sources that fund domestic violence services in the community, but we're very planful in how that funding gets put out there to ensure that there's no overlap or I lost my word, not overlap, duplication of services. So that, even if an agency is getting a FIPSA grant and a VOCA grant, or say their domestic violence shelter, the FIPSA grant is doing something different than the VOCA grant, and we're doing monitoring to ensure that those activities remain separate and that there's no overlap. Again, trying to ensure that the money goes as far as it possibly can for the biggest impact. But then I also thought about your question in terms of where sometimes, right, and I think about Tennessee Strong Families funding, that sometimes there's different parts of a program that are funded by different state agencies, and those state agencies try to come together and kind of identify how can we maximize the funding impact that we both have to ensure that we don't overlap and have anything that's redundant, but that we ensure that there's a continuum of services and a way to ensure that that if there's any opportunity to leverage the funding or to be able to say, for example, well, if you can provide this, and we have funding for this other thing, maybe we can find a little bit of money in the middle where there's no services, or maybe we can figure out how best to work together to coordinate services. And so we absolutely do that, not only in terms of our own funding that we put out in terms of ensuring that the state and federal funding is not duplicative or redundant, and ensure that, certain dollars are used over here in this way versus other dollars used in a different way. But we also do it when we recognize that maybe there's multiple agencies working towards the same ends, with a little bit of funding. And then those are the parts that I really enjoy, coming together with the other state agencies and going, well, if you can fund this and I can fund this, how can we maximize the benefit to the individuals receiving the service? Did that answer that question, Katie?
It did, and I think it was helpful, kind of almost from a program management standpoint of like how we communicate maybe with the organizations or agencies that we're working with, in regards to like opportunities or just even, I guess, the goals that we're all trying to work towards.
Right. Yeah. Another nice example of that is with our family justice centers. And so with our family justice centers, we will provide some basic funding to the Family Justice Center through VOCA. But then our shelters may have some FIPSA funding or state funding where they're funding advocates, and the advocates may come and work at the Family Justice Center a couple hours a week. We also provide funding to our legal aid societies, and our legal aid societies might come like one evening a week and just be on site at the Family Justice Center for any victims that need the legal aid society services, any kind of civil legal assistance. And then in those same communities, we might try to put a stop funded domestic violence and sexual assault law enforcement officer or prosecutor, because the more that community has a total focus on domestic violence, And the more we have victim services, investigations, prosecution, civil legal services all working together in that community in a coordinative, collaborative method of addressing the problem, the more synergy on responding to the issue and the more synergy on really making a difference in that problem in that community. And so that's been another way that we've leveraged funding. And with that, I know Logan needs to hop off and run. So why don't we go ahead and take a break? How about if we come back at 1:20? You can either jump off or just mute yourselves, and we'll start back up at 1:20. Okay, is everybody back to get started? Oh, I forgot. I need to, I think it's been recording the whole time, but let me see if I can get that to start back up. Okay, let me see. We've got a minute. Well, Katie, are you here too?
I'm back.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. All right. Well, everybody's back then, so we'll go ahead and get started. So coming back in, we're picking up at, we had finished talking about Governor Lee's criminal justice task force and its recommendations. We're going to start talking about what OCJP's strategic planning roundtable meeting is and what this group is comprised of and how do we utilize the roundtable. Basically, the roundtable is a title that we gave to the group and to the meeting where once a year we pull together representative from all the disciplines that you see listed on the screen into a meeting generally in the fall. We do it in the fall because we are in the process then of really kind of drafting and pulling together the open solicitations that we plan to post in the spring. We post our open solicitations usually between, for typical July 1 funding, we typically post them somewhere between January and March, so that we can get the applications in, hold the review teams, get the funding approved, go to contract, and have contracts that would start 7/1 for the beginning of the next fiscal year. So we typically try to hold this strategic roundtable in October. It's been as late as November. It's been as early as September. But just depending on the work of the office and what's going on. Prior to COVID, it was in person, and everybody would come in and we held the meeting from approximately 10 till about 2, roughly. And we did a working lunch. Since COVID, we really feel like virtually it's hard to keep people for more than a couple of hours. So it's gotten scaled back. I'm hopeful this may be our last year of virtual roundtable meetings, but we'll have to see what happens between now and next year to know if we're going to come back together in person or keep it virtually. But what we ask of the disciplines that are represented, we ask them to make a 3-year commitment. They can get reinstated for an additional 3-year commitment. We absolutely recognize that nobody knows when they make this commitment that whether or not their vacation or their child's graduation or some other major life event is going to keep them from attending. If they can attend, we ask that they either send a representative from their office or a colleague. If they can't identify one, we help to secure someone. So we really like to have at least 2 criminal judges, at least 2 prosecutors, at least 2 public defenders, 2 sheriffs, 2 chiefs, some representation from reentry-based programming and juvenile court programming, as well as victim service representatives in general, and specifically some culturally specific programming represented, or those that serve unserved, underserved, or inadequately served populations. When we're looking at our selections, we really look to ensure that we have representation from East, Middle, and West. We also like to make sure that we have representation from rural agencies, suburban agencies, and urban agencies. And as you heard me say in an earlier slide, oops, let's not, I think we jumped. I did jump. I kind of went through these out of order. I apologize. As you heard me say in an earlier discussion point, you know, what might work in an urban area may not work in a rural area. What might work in West Tennessee might not work in East Tennessee. And so we try to make sure that that strategic planning roundtable really pulls together a nice group of representation from all of those different voices of Tennesseans, if you will. And I apologize, I missed this slide. I was thinking it was after the other one and I had scrolled ahead. But I think that we've covered it in how I covered what the strategic planning roundtable meeting is. It's that particular meeting that most informs the 5-year strategic plan, as well as the annual addendums. And I won't say most informs, but there's a lot of information we glean from that meeting that really helps to shape our 5-year strategic plan and our annual addendums. When we ask the representatives to come to the meetings, another key point that we ask of them is, yes, we're a grant making office, but we're asking you to lend us your expertise and the voice, not only of your community, but the people, your colleagues that you represent in your discipline. So don't just tell me about what you as a chief in Madison County, or City of Jackson, excuse me, experience in Jackson, but tell me what all the chiefs are talking about when you have meetings. What are you hearing? What are the emerging issues? What are the gaps? What are the evidence-based and investigative techniques that people aren't going to, or there's not enough funding to cover? So we try to really encourage them to not only speak to, well, here's the biggest problem in my area, but here's what I hear my colleagues talking about. Here's what I hear, you know, here's a common thread that I've noticed with others across the state. And here's what I really think you need to know that the prosecutors need, or the judges need, or that justice-involved juveniles are struggling with, and we need to find a solution for this issue for justice-involved juveniles. So I think that we covered what it is and who's a member, and I talked a little bit more about the representation. Any questions about what we refer to as the OCJP Strategic Planning Roundtable meeting? Okay. Something that we added to our strategic planning process is something called victim forums. Now, OCJP has been doing strategic planning with crime victims really ever since I've been at OCJP. I mean, there were times when we would do surveys. There were times, especially before VOCA, where we pulled together groups of victim service providers in a multi-day event for them to tell us exactly, what were the biggest issues they were facing, what were the gaps in services, what did they need more of, what services weren't there that were desperately needed or weren't provided adequately enough. And so about 3 or 4 years ago, we also wanted to have an opportunity where on an annual basis, we were really hearing from victims and victim service providers on what the issues were with the kind of services that they needed but didn't get, what worked really well and maybe needed to be expanded. And so we went about that by developing a series of victim forums in the criminal justice, or excuse me, across the criminal justice system. And so we would look at victims, in particular, victims of violent crime, but also all victims of crime. And we would utilize Tennessee Voices for Victims to convene these meetings and moderate these meetings. And we have a series of questions. Each year we have a little different kind of information that we need from the victims and the victim service providers that are attending the forums. And it's really just a structured conversation to get at, what worked really well, either in the work that you do as a victim service provider or in the services you received as a victim. What didn't work so well? How can we help you? And a lot of the information that we get annually from the victim forums really informs our strategic planning and some of the solicitations that come out. It's really led to things like recognizing the need for a mass violence toolkit to be utilized by each of the prosecutors in each judicial district so that we always hope that there won't be another mass violence incident, but we also have to recognize that it's sort of the world that we're in. And so having a plan for responding is critical. Things like generating videos to help victims walk through the court process and understand the court process. That was a piece that came out of the victim forums. Priorities for housing, transportation, specific assistance. These are all things that we heard from victim services forums and victim forums that really helped inform our strategic plan and how we would prioritize our funding. And as I said, as critical as that was before the VOCA funding in the 2015 award, when it, more than doubled, more than tripled. And then it continued to increase up until the 2018 federal award. It's equally as critical now that the federal VOCA funding is decreasing, because as it decreases, we have to figure out, where's our line for the critical services? What do we have to ensure, even as money goes down and we have to let go of some things, how do we let go of some things without letting go of the most critical things? And so these forums are done virtually. Like I said, we've had as many as 6 in 1 year, as few as 3. I think we're planning to do 3 this year. Any questions on the victim forums? The next thing, and I talked about this a little bit in the first and second slide, when I said, you know, on an ongoing basis, the Office of Criminal Justice programs is working with stakeholder groups. And in those stakeholder groups, we get critical information that informs our strategic plans. This is a smattering of the various stakeholder working groups, task forces, advisory committees, associations that we meet with regularly, where when we attend, we're listening for gaps, we're listening for needs, we're listening for, oh, well, this right here works, but it would really work better if we just had this. It doesn't take that much funding, but we don't know where to turn for funding. Or, you know, oh, there's this new initiative coming out that sounds a little bit like what we're doing. Maybe we have to set a meeting afterward to connect and make sure that there's, you know, a clear distinction between what you're funding and what we're funding, or an opportunity for synergy between what we're funding. And these meetings, some of these meetings happen monthly or every other month. Some of these meetings happen quarterly. Some of these meetings happen a couple of times a year. And not all of the meetings are attended, of course, by everyone. At OCJP, it's typically a certain group that are slated to attend certain meetings. The Integrated Criminal Justice Steering Committee, that has a lot to do with state technology and information sharing across state agencies and with local law enforcement. That tends to be myself, Jeremiah, Gary, and occasionally Ron that attend the Integrated Criminal Justice Steering Committee group. The Sexual Assault Advisory Committee and Working Group, that's probably Chelsea on Trish's team that is attending that at this point. Most likely Trish is attending it as well. I attend the Human Trafficking Advisory Committee, and likely will be involving Katie and Trish in that soon. Susan Candon, along with Jeremiah, handle the Shelter Directors Working Group, which is the domestic violence shelters. The Sexual Assault Nurse Examiner Meeting Group, that's a group that, as far as I understand it, has been held by the Department of Health. And we kind of come in and out of that meeting as needed, but they're absolutely essential partners in thinking about our STOP funding and thinking about our BOCA funding and overall just planning for the needs of sexual assault victims in the state of Tennessee. The pretrial working group was a group that pretty much came together and worked around our state pretrial funding. Although we were doing JAG pretrial funding before we received state funding for that. The Chiefs Association and Sheriff's Association, both of those groups meet every other month. And we try to make it in some capacity to those meetings, most of the time just for a portion of time, because those meetings tend to be a multi-day meeting. They do a lot of their annual training at those meetings, but wherever we can be part of discussions and meetings, sometimes we come and present to them about open solicitations and such resources. And then other times we're doing friendly reminders about why it's important to ensure that your TIBR's compliant and you're complying with death in custody reporting. The Family Justice Center Advisory Committee, I think that's falling to Tricia's team. It was a part of Susan's team. The Adverse Childhood Experiences Public Sector Group, that is actually renamed from Building Strong Brains, Tennessee to the Tennessee Resilience Collaborative. And that's a meeting I tend to go to. It's one that will strongly connect to Katie's team. And so I foresee Rachel starting to attend that with me. The STOP Implementation Planning Group is on Amy's team, and Amy leads that up. And the Vulnerable Adults Coordinated Community Response Team, that is a coordinated community response team across state agencies that addresses the needs of vulnerable adults. These are adults with that are other abled intellectually or in other manners, and also elder adults. And any agency that provides services or oversight to those that provide services to that population, they come together monthly and quarterly to kind of just collaborate, connect, identify opportunities where they can work together smarter, more efficiently, more effectively. And there are local community coordinated response teams. We try to have the state level team attend the local level team so that information goes up and down across those community response teams. So I just threw a smattering of the various groups that we get information from that help inform our strategic plan onto this slide. There's a whole host of additional task forces, the Dangerous Drugs Task Force, for example, that aren't even on here, but are absolutely essential to ensuring that we know what the state needs are, what the gaps in services are, and allow us to effectively and efficiently plan for meeting those needs. Any questions about any of the stakeholder working groups or anything that I said that was unfamiliar or jargon talk that you didn't understand? Okay. And that's it. So we have talked through the OCJP strategic planning and priority setting process. I will share the slides from this training with you. I will also just let you know where you can find the OCJP strategic plans. You go onto our website, you go to the strategic planning section, and then it's got annual strategic plans. As you can see, our 5-year strategic plan was done for 2022. That means we were planning in 21, writing in 22 for how we were going to use funds, or excuse me, for how we're going to use funds in state fiscal year 22. Then every year after that, until it's time for a new 5-year strategic plan, we do an addendum. So this is the addendum that helped to plan for the 23 fiscal year. This was the addendum that helped plan for FY24, which is the fiscal year we're currently in. And we're in the process of setting the meetings. The roundtable will be next month, the last Friday of the month. And I believe there's 3 victim forums that will be next month. And all of that will inform the addendum for FY25. So we're always planning a year ahead, so that our plans align with new funding that'll start 7/1 for the next fiscal year. You have some of the executive summaries of the roundtables listed here, the STOP implementation plan. And then these later years are where we used to split up and have our criminal justice strategic plan versus our victim service strategic plan, whereas now it's combined. I'll make sure that you have the link to this as well as the slides from the PowerPoint. But at this point, that concludes the training for today. I don't know if anyone has any questions. And if you don't have any questions, I just thank you all for attending. You will also be in a training with me on major fund sources. That one will take every bit of an hour and a half. It's a longer one. It'll probably be scheduled for you all somewhere in the next couple of weeks, before the end of October at the very least. But again, no one's going to quiz you. Did you remember everything that I said today? Or it's really just to put a foundation and a base together for you of kind of understanding how the office works and makes that plan. Likewise will be true for the major fund source training. So just want to say thank you. It was a pleasure to talk with you all today. And if you ever have any questions or concerns, please don't hesitate and reach out. Okay? Have a nice afternoon.
You too.
Thank you.